In this episode, we take a look at what's going on at Columbia and other college campuses, where so-called peaceful protests over Israel's actions in Gaza are creating quite a stir. And in part two of our discussion, we'll weigh in on whether the slotted salary for Caitlin Clark, who's a former Iowa Hawkeye star and recent number one draft pick in the WNBA draft, whether her salary is unfair compared to men's sports or considering how much increased money and exposure she's bringing to the WNBA already. Hello, welcome to the Call It Like I See It podcast. I'm James Keys, and riding shotgun with me today is a man who's always ready to drop a few precious gems on the show. Tunde Ogunlana. Tunde, are you ready to share with us some things that some would consider to be a girl's best friend?
Of course, man. I'm just trying to figure out if there's a way to describe gems as unprecious. Some of my stuff might fall into that category, but we'll let the audience decide.
For sure. Now, we're recording this on April 23rd, 2024. And Tunde, while there have been some level of demonstrations and protests going on around the country since essentially Hamas attacked Israel and then Israel declared war on Hamas and began attacking in Gaza, things have really picked up over the past week, particularly we've seen at some college campuses. At Columbia, we've seen demonstrations and encampments spring up on campus. And we've seen, these get forcibly cleared by the police. And what the protesters seem to be thinking or seem to be seeking is the divestment of the school from Israel. But there have been other elements in these protests, and at least reportedly involved as well. So things don't seem to be slowing down. In fact, they seem to be picking up at this point. So just in general, what do you think is going on with these protests and, the strong pushback that we're seeing also from whether it be, the universities or the universities in conjunction with law enforcement?
Very good questions. I mean, what are we seeing? Let's cut to that chase. I think we're seeing the same thing everyone else is seeing: protests on certain college campuses. They seem to be concentrated in the Northeast and in certain enclaves, and primarily Ivy League. I know that the big ones that have taken attention in this recent period is Columbia University. Now we've seen it spilling over to Yale, MIT, and certain other schools, Tufts University, so kind of that Northeast corridor. And so, I'd say in that sense, this is good old American protest stuff. But I know that part of our conversation today is what makes this one a little bit different, or not this one, but this series of protests feel a bit different than things we've seen, both recent and older kind of.
Well, it's anticlimactic a little bit, but this to me is just what open societies look like. People see people will see the same occurrence, and different things about it will take on an increased or added significance, and they'll feel very strongly about it. And so, in terms of what I think is happening, I think there are two things that are happening. If you're looking at the protest side, there is a good faith side, which may be minimized. Like that side we may not hear about as much, like the people that are out there trying to peacefully protest, that are trying to make a point in terms of what you can say the atrocities happening in Gaza and to the Palestinian people. There are people that are doing that. And then there may be people who opportunistically are trying to latch onto that and take advantage and pushing other agendas, whether it be anti-Semitic, whether it be, whatever, just chaos. So with both of those going on, anyone who then sees the protest is able to say, okay, well, if I like the cause that they're standing behind, then I'm going to focus on the good faith part. If I don't like the cause that they're supporting, then I'll focus on the people which again appear to be a smaller number of people that are creating chaos or that are acted up. It reminds me of, in the same way that in the summer of 2020, there were these mass protests, demonstrations regarding following the George Floyd the tragedy. And depending on what you watched and depending on where you came down on the issue, your focus on the protest was either on the thousands of people that were peacefully demonstrating in the street or the tens of people that might have been breaking some law. And so to me, that's really what I see here, is that this is just the messiness of public demonstration. When you have a public demonstration and you say, hey, we're going to protest this, anybody who wants to come out can come out. you can't then say, okay, well, what exactly are you going to do, sir? Okay, well, you can come in. Oh, you're going to do that, sir? You can't come in. So to me, there's an inherent, when you have actions by the people, there's an inherent messiness to it, and we're seeing that messiness and how that's getting interpreted a lot of times by people who aren't in it. I'm not there, and then but in most of the country, we're seeing this. We're not there. We're interpreting it based on the lens of what we think of the actual content of the protest, and so that's why you'll see people who aren't there come down very strongly on one side or the other, which, again, is notable to me because it's like, well, to come down so strongly on something that you're only getting second and third hand accounts on, means you came into that with something.
Yeah. Well, I think, look, that's this topic is one of many where we can say people are coming in with second and third hand information, more so than in the past because of all the ability to disrupt information online and with our kind of regular media, cable news, all that stuff. So I would say that's been our experience for probably the last decade in our culture and our society, where people are coming to these conversations and arguments, whether they be about elections or other things, with all this other information that confirms pre-existing biases. I think what makes this one even more probably painful for all of us to experience and messy is that this topic specifically, I mean, more than any other, I'm 46 years old, and in my life, the Israel-Palestinian conflict has been the messiest conflict ongoing since I was born. I was born in 1978, and they had a war in 73 with the Arab neighbors, Israel did. This has been going on. Then you had the stuff in the early 80s with the PLO and the factions that were put into Lebanon, which led to the bombing of our barracks in Beirut, when we had the Marines stationed there because we were trying to be some sort of peacekeeper in the region. And that's where, again, President Reagan did probably what was the right thing at the time. He said, we're out of here. Like, we're not going to be in the middle of this mess in 1983. And then what happened is they kept going. And by the early 90s, you had that meetings between President Clinton and Arafat. And I can't remember, I'm sorry, at the top of my head, the prime minister of Israel at the time. But that was happening when I was a teenager in high school. Then you go, post 9/11, you had the things in '06, the election of Hamas, and then you had the Intifada in 2014. I mean, this issue has been front and center on the world stage for decades. So I feel like when you have what we just said about people coming to conversations with second and third hand stuff and their own confirmation bias being stroked, on top of the fact that it's probably the most sensitive geopolitical topic for generations, I think you're going to have, this is like a real Rorschach test for many of us in society that are looking at it. And I think you make a great point. Many of us look at it and just see things that we already want to see.
Yeah. Depending on how we feel about the overall point that's being made. Because the thing that's new about this, though, is that this is a new generation, necessarily. Yeah. The college students, again, that are the primary participants. Because, again, once you open up a protest, and there have been reports that this is not all just the college students there anymore. Like there's other people that want to be a part of this. And, again, some of that can be good faith, and then other that could be chaos and or people taking advantage of the cover to because they have other agendas, even agendas that are counterproductive. But this is college students. These are young people in the United States today, and they are looking at this in a way that I would consider to be not necessarily the country line of the United States over the past half a decade or half a century or whatever. And so that, I think, creates another kind of pressure point here, is that the young people aren't now. Granted, they don't come in with all of the kind of background, some of the stuff that you just ran through, but also they are reacting to what we see on the ground right now. And we talked about this when we had talked about the initial conflict, just in terms of anyone can look at this, and rightfully anyone, meaning a Palestinian or an Israeli, can look at this and say, yeah, we were wronged. Like there have been enough things that have happened either recently or historically that where, like any side can justifiably say that we've been wronged. And so therefore, therefore we can, that's where the, things can become, I guess it's more of a test of character and just what you believe, the type of principles that you have. But because of that, it's one of these situations where you don't have one consensus, quote unquote, right answer that feels relatively attainable. And we just have to get the will to get there. There are answers that aren't going to satisfy much of anyone. and which is kind of the tendency with compromise a lot of times. But because everyone can reach back into recent and distant past and say, well, but we were wrong. Why should we have to compromise? There's no easy kind of direction to take this. And so when you have that situation and when you have passions on either side, then positions harden, and it's hard to bridge the gap. And so because of all that, what we're seeing is right now is that being manifested where we have a younger generation in this country that's looking at this and saying, well, hey, we think the Palestinians are getting the short end of the stick here. And that is causing conflict, I think, amongst, just the mainstream, the mainstream of the United States, and so how they're looking at these conflicts, they're saying, are these protests are saying, oh, well, hold up, you're taking the quote unquote wrong side. And so therefore viewing the protests in a negative light, like I said before, because they'll focus on the negative things that are happening because they want to view what's happening in a negative light.
Yeah, and there's so many cross currents culturally. I mean, you make a great point about the young generation today, because again, if you're 20 years old right now, a lot of this is new to you, and so kind of coming into the world and growing up and now seeing all this stuff happening right now. You may have a lack of context of, like I said, the fact that my whole life, and I'm in my mid 40s, this has been going on. I think the other big thing is,
even if you understand that academically, what you've grown and lived in is the question of whether Gaza is an open air prison, and settlers in Israel, going into the West Bank, and like you've lived in a time where the what's happened to the Palestinians from a negative standpoint stands out above what's happened to the Israelis, but if you go back another 10 years, then you might say, oh, well, but you have more context. You see where, again, you bring more into the fray where you might understand that academically, but what you actually are reacting to, I think, is more of what you've lived and experienced and, what you're seeing, in social media feeds or whatever. So I do want to keep this moving though.
But let me just answer that because that's a very good point. So think about anyone in college today. Hamas won their election, the last democratically held election in the Palestinian territories in 2006, which would be 18 years ago, the age of a college freshman today. So to your point, what a young person sees about the relation between Israel and Palestinians is different than someone like me who was alive to see what happened before 2006 and the kind of differences, right? So it's just, I can appreciate a bit more nuance where, to your point, someone younger doesn't have that nuance. The second thing I'll just end here, and I know we want to move is, and I want to keep talking about this, is really the influences of images online. I think that's changed a lot of how people react to different conflicts. And because I think if we had seen some of this stuff when we were at the height of the Iraq War in 2003, 2004, maybe how we were hurting civilians, maybe we would have had a different response here. So I think a lot of this plays into itself, a lot of these different factors.
Well, yeah, just perspective, like one's perspective oftentimes will go a long way to determine how they perceive something and how they react to it. And so it's not to say that a person who has a perspective that is longer here is inherently more right, because you're ultimately making value judgments on what's more important or whose harm should be prioritized. We should prioritize rectifying or whatever. And that, again, that's going down a road that is not necessarily that that road will, from a productive standpoint, end in compromise, but compromise that hasn't been really the name of the game so far, in the last 80 years, in this part of the world. So there is one piece that I want, and I kind of generally rubbed over this in terms of there's good faith protesting, which we can see, because if all the protesters were behaving as the reports of the worst protesters, then it wouldn't be occurring as if it would be utter chaos, and and it wouldn't be any type of thing that was that didn't need to get broken up immediately, so to speak. But we have heard reports of aggressive behavior in the protests, intimidation, violence. Again, these have been scattered, but towards Jewish people in America. Again, these aren't Jewish representatives of the Israeli state, but just either fellow students or professors or whatever, just people who, quote unquote, happen to be Jewish and are in America, but aren't generals in the IDF or something like that. So What do you think now? Do you think that's something where the media might be overblowing these reports, or that people may be saying, "Oh, I feel this way," but it may be something that's kind of again overblown? Or do you think that this is something that we need to look very closely at, and just your overall reaction to that piece of this?
I mean, I wouldn't say it appears to be overblown. Obviously, that's serious stuff that should be looked at. But I think it's been well documented just through seeing signs in certain protesters about, how the negative stuff they feel about Jewish people, or like you're saying, equating all Jews with the Israeli government's decisions on how it behaves. And I think that, I was thinking about even in preparing for today. I mean, a lot of people forget that a lot of, hundreds of thousands and maybe even millions of Israelis who were Jewish last year protested in 2023 their own government and changes that were being proposed to their legal system via the Supreme Court and all that in Israel. So, like we talk about with a lot of things when it comes to this culture and stuff like that, like, Jews are not a monolith, just like blacks aren't, just like whites aren't, just like other groups of humans aren't. And, there's enough Jewish people in the world, in and outside of Israel, that, there's a fraction within the Jewish community as to how to respond to something like October 7th. Now, so I think this is where it starts to get very messy and it becomes this kind of Rorschach test again, where I think your point is well made a few minutes ago when you said there's people out there that genuinely are bleeding heart types that do feel that the Palestinian people have had a tough time and they need help. And there's, longstanding nonprofits that have dealt with that and all that. And that could be something akin to other.
I don't think you need to sum people up that think that as bleeding heart types. There are people can come to that conclusion without being a bleeding heart type.
Well, I don't mean that pejoratively. I'm just saying you can be a bleeding heart person and care about the environment, care about other groups.
But my point is that you could be a law and order person and come to that same conclusion. Like I don't know that the type of person you are.
Well, let's not get caught up on that. It was just an example to say that I mean it more as there's a genuine way that people will see other human beings that don't aren't having a good go at life right now or in any context. And I think we can all acknowledge that the Palestinian people have had a very difficult time for a long time, right? In general. So there's that. But I think that it is obvious and blatantly obvious that there's a lot of actors coming in who are just riding this bandwagon, in my opinion, of anti-Semitism. And they're using this conflict as an excuse to just brandish their pre-existing feeling of the fact that they don't like Jews. And so I think it makes the whole thing much messier because it's hard to determine who's out there really just trying to say we got to do the humanitarian stuff and all that, and who's out there saying this is my chance to light up Jews and to behave in a negative way towards people I already don't like. And I think that's what we're seeing now is that aggressive part of the bigotry part has definitely infiltrated what we're seeing.
I think the way you put it, like from an opportunistic standpoint, it's kind of like this presents the getting is good, so to speak, if for a person who may harbor anti-Semitic views, because they can blend in with groups that are saying, hey, the Palestinians aren't being treated fairly, and use that as a kind of an in to then go towards just anti-Semitism in general. Not saying because saying the Palestinians aren't being treated fairly doesn't inherently say that something bad needs to happen to Jewish people. It's saying, hey, let's come up with a solution that treats everybody more fairly. But from the anti-Semitic standpoint, it's like, okay, well, let's stop being unfair to the Palestinians and let's be unfair to the Jewish people. And it's like, whoa, that wasn't necessarily the person who, as you artfully put it, the bleeding heart type or other, someone who is just interested in fairness or law and order wouldn't go from let's stop treating one person unfairly to let's start treating someone else unfairly. It's like, hey, let's try to find something again where everybody can get a relatively fair go of it. I think this reminds me, actually, I think this is a tendency in humans that we all have to fight against. And when you have good leadership does well, or at least when you have leadership that is behaving in a way that is productive, they will guide you away from this. I think of post 9/11 in the United States, where there was sentiment. There were people who were already kind of anti-Islam, and the getting was good then to be anti-Islam and to say, hey, let's not be about like not being fair to Muslims, to people, the Islamic faith. And but it was saying, hey, what happened here was not Islam, did not attack the U.S. on 9/11 and George Bush. There were a lot of things I disagreed with on George Bush, but that was something I thought was very strong leadership. He was like, hey, no, we're not at war with Islam. This is specific actors who did something heinous, and we're after them. But they don't represent the whole faith. We're not going to condemn a whole faith because of what these people did. And I think in this case, it's a mistake, and it's really messed up to try to put and say, okay, well, I don't like what the Israeli state might be doing, and say, okay, well, therefore, then I have a problem with a Jewish person, a Jewish person in the United States or a Jewish person anywhere, because again, they have no more that a single Jewish person has no control over, or doesn't have overall control over what the Israeli government does. If you want to be mad at somebody, be mad at Netanyahu, so to speak, but not some student walking across the yard. So that confusion only makes the issue, makes it harder for us to find compromise, to find common ground, to try to move things forward. Because it's like, but again, this is a natural inclination that I think some people have beyond just the kind of the guys jumping off the top rope that came in with the anti-Semitism already. I think that it's something that people who might start out in a good place, they have to be careful to not fall into that, because it seems to be kind of a natural tendency for people to do. And I mean, the not post 9/11 stuff is just one example, but we see there's countless examples over time in this where, a actor does something and then you have to actively work against saying, well, anybody who looks like that, or anybody who follows the same God as that, or anybody who, whatever, like in that same context is a avatar to me of what I don't like that this other person did.
Yeah, no, look, I'm laughing because when you said coming off the top ropes, I'm going to date myself. I had a vision of Jimmy the Superfly Snicker just coming all over like the Iron Sheik or something. But
see, but you go Rey Mysterio, and you can bring in all the generations.
I'm too old for that. Yeah,
you're too old for Rey Mysterio too.
Yeah, that's my kids. That's my middle kid was Rey Mysterio and John Cena. but no, so. This is where, to me, you said a few good things that I want to kind of just latch onto. One is by blaming all Jews for this. I mean, this is where you get deep with it. This is where anti-Semitism is one of the oldest conspiracy theories on the planet. You and I may not believe this, but there are people out there that do believe that all Jews kind of control the world. And they kind of believe, I don't know why, that every single Jew somehow is like a hive mind connected, and that they're all in this evil cabal, and I think in today's world of conspiracy with QAnon and Pizzagate and all that, these anti-Semitic type of tropes about world domination and banking and this whole thing about globalists and George Soros is going to take over the world with his little bit of billions, when you got people out there like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos worth 50 times more than that guy. It all lends itself to this idea that a lot of people are primed to already view anything that Jews do that might be considered negative as like, okay, let's just go off the cliff and assume that they're all bad. It's like the propaganda in the early 20th century domestically in the United States against blacks, when it was just like, that guy raped a white woman, let's go hang him from a tree. And people did that. Like, it was just all these beliefs, that blacks were these savages just, crisscrossing the land, and you had to lock your door at night to save yourself from them. And so this is no different. So this is classic tribalism, stereotypes, and all that. But you said something very important about leadership. I just wanted to hit up, because as you were talking, you alluded to this a bit, and it reminded me of something like the Unite the Right rally. That really shocked me in 2017, because think about it. You had a group of people that said they were coming to Charlottesville to defend what they said was history and this whole stuff. Somehow, remember that Friday night, we had a group of hundreds of young men with tiki torches looking like Crystal Knot talking about Jews will not replace us. And that's what I'm saying. How do you go from saying, hey, I'm just going to hold this rally to discuss taking down Confederate statues? Obviously, some actors got in there who said, hey, we got to now make this about Jews too, which had nothing to do with statues and the Confederacy, right? And so that's why it's interesting how these type of topics like anti-Semitism seem to flow in through other kind of cultural memes. And then the other important thing, like you said about former President Bush, which I have a lot to criticize as well. The first time in my life, we had an American president that when that type of anti-Semitism took place out in the open, he stated there was fine people on both sides. He didn't make a very strong condemnation like
You're
I've
not
seen
talking about
every.
Bush right now, then.
No,
No, yeah, okay. Well, you got to just.
I said if we had a former president.
Yeah. You're talking about Donald Trump. Yeah.
Obviously, it's 2017 is what I'm talking about. So my point is just
but a
saying.
college student, now would have been 10 years old then, or 11 years old. So it just makes.
I find that when you drop certain names, people stop listening to what you're saying. They just focus only on the fact you said that name. So that's what I'm just trying to say.
It just evokes all the emotion that they have about that. Only certain names, though. There's only certain names.
Yeah, that's why I said I really want to focus on the events. So,
there you go.
No, but you got it right. It's who I'm talking about. Yeah. But, so that was kind of my point. Is just saying I just wanted to follow on that you're right. Leadership's important because that's the only time I've ever seen a leader of our country not condemn that type of behavior when it was blatantly out in the open and reminded me a lot of like Kristallnacht. You literally had kids carrying torches saying Jews will not replace us. I don't know how much more anti-Semitic you can get than that and saying blood and soil. So, this is an issue we have and I just want to end here. A lot of people want to use this college stuff now to say, oh, this is an example of the left's anti-Semitism. And I'm just saying anti-Semitism is like child pedophilia. It crosses all boundaries, unfortunately.
And I was wondering where you're going with that.
Yeah, no, that's why I use something negative like pedophilia is you can't say, oh, just this group does it. Unfortunately, it's a virus that affects people, a minority of people in all groups, and anti-Semitism is no different.
Yeah. It can that can pop up anywhere, and to try to make anti-Semitism or several like that's a kind of a weakness that we have in our political discourse is that people almost seem to want to view everything from a polarized lens and say, okay, well, is this an issue of the left or an issue of the right or an issue of the center? And it's like, well, no, some issues actually don't lend themselves to that. It's like this kind of mentality or behavior can show up anywhere, and you limit your own ability to understand what's going on or react to what's going on if you view everything in a partisan lens. Naturally, though, partisans like you to view everything in a partisan lens because that allows them to behave as they want, and people will excuse it away because at least you're not the other side. And to that point, actually, one thing I'll mention here, which I think our condemnation of anti-Semitism is clear. And if it's not, then, definitely any type of anti-Semitism that's coming in with this legitimate anti-Semitism where people are trying to conflate or otherwise intimidate Jews, anything like that with what's happening in Israel, all of that. But I will note that oftentimes, or sometimes at least, I'll see legitimate criticism, people raising questions, again, with the Israeli government. And that's what the biggest difference here is it can't be about individual people who happen to be Jewish, but it's like the Israeli government. And the Israeli government sometimes will opportunistically try to say any criticism of the government itself and its actions is anti-Semitic, which isn't necessarily the case. And so that to me is something that everything can't be it. Like there has to be a way where you can say, hey, I don't agree with what this government is doing. But again, it can never be just because you don't agree with some government is doing, you can't then take that out on people or a non-government actor in the same way with, I don't agree with what Al-Qaeda does or with ISIS does. And so therefore that doesn't mean that I look at anyone who happens to share the same religion as them as I don't like them too. Like, so that's what we have to be able to do to be able to break apart. But because people have tribal instincts, it's hard to do that. And then again, actors who want less accountability might try to fool people with that and say, oh, well, any criticism of me, you're just criticizing me, not because of what I've done, but because of who I am. And that's just not always the case. What's happening here, and the other thing I just want to mention for the point of this is that
they're coming after me because they want to come after you, that kind of stuff. Sorry, man. I couldn't resist.
Manipulation. Yes. The other piece about this, and this is where I think the protesters, you have to be careful also with everything. Can't be in the same way I just said Israel. You can't let them off their government. You can't let them off the hook by saying, oh, well, when they say anybody criticizes me as anti-Semitic, that's not necessarily true. The protesters have to be careful with the idea of, okay, we have sympathy for the Palestinian cause. We think the Palestinians are getting a raw deal here. Let's try to help the Palestinians. They got to be careful equating that to Hamas, because Hamas is like, if you're for the Palestinian cause, that doesn't mean you then need to support Hamas. Hamas is doing their own thing. And what their thing is not necessarily supporting other Palestinians either. And a lot of times, again, with this polarized way that people tend to want to view things, you say, okay, well, if I'm against what the state of Israel is doing, then I must have some level of support for Hamas. And no, that is not the case at all. Like, you can look at what the Israeli government is doing as overreach. You can look at what Hamas is doing, and saying that was they provoked it. They're not in there trying to help the Palestinian people. You can find error in both of those entities and look at it from a humanitarian standpoint and just say, I don't like what's happened to the people. The people who got kidnapped, it went and Hamas attacked, and the people that got killed there, or the things that have happened to the people in Gaza since then. And so I think, to me, there needs to be an effort, and this would be through leadership, to resist the temptation to try to say, okay, well, I'm just on this side, and so I'm going to look the other way on whatever this side does that I may not think is the best thing to do, or I'm just on the other side, so. With the protesters, I think I would caution that, because I do see that, and we have seen situations where students are taking the side of Hamas, which is very different, in my view, from taking the side of Palestinians and saying, hey, that they shouldn't have to live in this war zone and tens of thousands have been killed and so forth. That's a very different thing than saying, hey, we stand with Hamas, because Hamas is not a good guy in this situation.
Yeah, I mean, and that's where you just have to take it for its face, right? I'm sure there's some of those kids which are naive and don't really understand what Hamas is about, and what kind of that style of way of being, let's call it, that the very authoritarian style of Islam produces in certain societies within the Middle East. I mean, it's another, just like these groups are supported by Iran, and Iran is well known for killing a young lady a year or two ago because she dared show a little bit of her hair behind her hijab to go against the authorities. So a lot of these kids, and that's what makes this a little bit just dizzying to look at from the outside, because a lot of these, in this case of this protest, unlike the Unite the Right rally in 2017, a lot of these kids probably would consider themselves more progressive, more, in solidarity with LGBTQ rights and racial rights and all this kind of stuff, which then carry signs supporting a group like Hamas, which is the antithesis of a lot of progressive ideas.
Yeah, that's not what you think it is. That's not standing with the Palestinians necessarily. That's a different statement. Now, if you have read what Hamas is about and you want to make that statement, you're allowed to in this country. But that's not that we will look at that much differently than the person who says, hey, we need to make sure that the Palestinians get support and that they're not subjected to living in a war zone. That's a very different statement to express support for Hamas. And so I would implore people to make sure they know what they're doing. Hamas will tell you who they are. It's not a secret, so you can find that out. You can read about it and everything. So, but I just real quick before I want to get us on to part two. But before we go, just a more technical question. Your thoughts on the use of the college campus, which Columbia is a private university, but, some of these schools are private, some are public, but the use of the college campus as the site of the protest. Now, to their point, what they're officially protesting, so to speak, is the school's involvement with the Israeli government or the Israeli military and so forth. But do you have strong positions or strong thoughts one way or the other on the use of the actual school facility, like the yard at the school or whatever for the site of these protests?
Not generally. I mean, I would say, obviously, like any protest anywhere, I would say, if you just freedom of assembly is part of our First Amendment. As you said, it's a private campus, but taking that out of it, it's still the ability to assemble, with respect and not commit violence and all that, and not intimidate people and not be anti-Semitic or bigoted towards other people. I would say, I support protests that, don't go negative. Obviously, a lot of these protests have gone negative, and that's where I think, we said a lot of things in the discussion today. And, looking back historically, because I look back, number one, a fun fact I learned in preparing for today that Columbia University was actually founded by King George II. That's how old it is. So I thought that was cool. But, I started reading about just the history of some of this stuff. So like the 1968 protests, they seem to be a big mess. I mean, I didn't know until preparing for today that, a lot of the students were actually occupying various buildings and wouldn't
Yeah.
leave. So it's
Well,
different
but
than
I
just
mean, I think,
occupying a square.
but we can assume though any successful protest, any protest that gets a certain level of kind of turnover is going to be a mess. Like that's kind of
Yeah.
that's kind
Well,
of
but here,
the part of the
let me explain that because number one, in this part of the discussion, it's important. That's why I think we all should continue to look at history. Because once you see that these things have happened before, it takes kind of the severity of what's going on. It kind of tampers it down a bit. Okay, this is just another moment, like you said, in the culture, in our history, where young people feel the like you said in the democracy, the need to kind of unleash a bit. Now, we've already discussed where we criticize the way that some people are unleashing, that, you know, the anti-Semitism and all that's very negative, and also the ability to get kind of swayed. And that's what I'm saying. Like when I look at what I read about 1968, you got several things. 68, you only had 3 years since the 65 Civil Rights Act. You're in the height of all that stuff, Robert F. Kennedy, MLK, the Vietnam War. So you had issues of really domestic cultural issues like civil rights and feminism. But then, like we alluded to earlier, you had the Vietnam War, and that was the last time we had a draft in this country. Now, who does a draft affect? People college age. So I can appreciate that in that era, people in their late teens, early 20s were really anxious about a lot of things because I wouldn't want to be drafted into the war if I didn't agree with it either. So I kind of get all that. That's why I said this protest today seems to be, it's just different because these kids on these campuses aren't being threatened domestically by either culture stuff like in the 60s or by being said, hey, we're going to send you to Southeast Asia for a war that you don't even understand. And so that's why to me, I do see it as now a middle-aged person looking at the outside and already having put 2 kids through college myself. I feel like if one of my kids was up there, I'd be on the phone saying, go to class. You know, like, what are you doing out there? And so,
you're saying though, I mean, so what you're saying though is that it's based on the content. You want to say that protest is valid based on whether the content you find to be justifying it or not. Because that's a very anti-American way to
directly. Yeah, I would be an old curmudgeon if I had one of my kids in that.
Well, but at least you're being honest though, and I think that's honest. I think
this is the hill to die on for my kids. That's all I'm going to say.
Well, for your kids is yeah. I mean, that goes beyond whether what they're doing is, you know, it should be legal or should be something we embrace. Because that's really why I look at it more than anything is like, I think it raises interesting concerns because when you're protesting in public spaces, then, you know, it's anybody comes. If it's a college, you know, like I can understand a private college. I can understand the school being like, look, students, that's one thing. This is where you live. I think that the colleges would be going the wrong way to try to, and some colleges have been doing this. Harvard, for example, closed their yard. I think that's going the wrong direction, saying the students can't be here because this is where the students are. Now, I do think it probably is worthwhile for them to make efforts to prevent non-students from coming in because, again, the college environment is one, like it's not an open environment, so to speak. You don't necessarily need 40-year-olds in there who have different agendas and so forth. If the students want to protest and they are living on campus or they are on campus, this is their campus, then I think that's something that should be protected. But again, like if they want a general population protest, they got to take it somewhere where it's a public space. And so that to me is really what I see here, because there have been reports of people who aren't necessarily students that are coming into these, and that mix creates risk that I don't know that the colleges should be forced to bear. You know, if it's just the students, then yeah, the colleges, you know, you guys can deal with that. You know, like these schools charge a lot of money. You know, like so they can deal with students, you know, organizing, protesting in peaceful ways. They do have to figure out ways to try to make sure people feel safe on campus. And, you know, that's the challenge always, you know, safety versus freedom of expression. But, you know, they're big, you know, they're adults. They can figure that thing out. I don't think that our goal in society should try to make everything be easy for people. You know, it's okay. Well, from a principle standpoint, what does this stuff mean? And, you know, students are on campus there. You can draw a line between the students and non-students, but at the same time, we can't draw a line saying, oh, well, this is just too hard, so we're going to shut it all down, which is kind of what Harvard did versus, you know, Columbia saying, okay, hey, if you're going to do it, you know, like we want to put constraints on it to make sure that it's done in a way that we can still go about our business of educating people. And again, I don't think the question shouldn't be whether that's easy enough for them. So I want to wrap our conversation from there. We appreciate everybody for joining us on part one of this discussion. Part two of this week's discussion will be coming up soon. So we hope that you join us with that as well.